different areas that people study. So we're going to talk about reproduction today. And like the other lectures, it's going to involve some biology. So it's going to be some kind of material with some scientific terms. So just try to hang in there with me. And again, if you have the book, I suggest kind of going through that on your own time or going through the lecture notes to really kind of get this material down because it's challenging. So before we get started, just a little bit of terminology that you'll kind of see in the lecture. So gamete, we mentioned in the previous lecture on Tuesday. So that's just a sex cell. So that would be either the sperm or the egg. So that's all it means. It's just kind of a scientific name for sex cell. And then gonad is the organ that produces the gametes. So that would be the testes and the ovaries in both male and female. And then libido is just the desire to mate. So just some pretty general terms there. So males and females obviously have different sexual characteristics. So males have production of large numbers of the haploid male gamete, which would be spermatozoa or sperm. Just to make it easy, I'm probably just going to say sperm since spermatozoa is a little bit harder of a word to remember. But spermatozoa is kind of the official name for that. And then those are produced by the primary reproductive organ, or the gonad, which will be the testes. And then you have production of male hormones. So male hormones are called androgens, and the main one, which you have probably heard before, is testosterone. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. And then some of the anatomy and the parts of the male reproductive tract include the penis, the ducts, and accessory organs, which we'll go into detail about later. And then you have your secondary sexual characteristics, which I know we talked a little bit about in poultry with the rooster, and kind of that's what helps you distinguish males and females. So that would be like the comb and wattle, spurs and roosters, and then also similar features in turkeys, pheromones in pigs, goats and sheep, and then antlers in deer would kind of also count as your secondary sex characteristics. So the behavior that males will exhibit when they're ready to mate will kind of be mounting behavior. They may show aggression and then crowning, and then males also show libido, which is just that desire to mate. So for female sexual characteristics, you have the production of the female gametes, or sex cells, so the eggs, by the primary reproductive organ, which would be the ovaries or the ovary. And I put both because poultry actually only have one. So most other species have two ovaries, but poultry have one. Then you have the production of the estrogens, so particularly estradiol, which we'll talk about in more detail. You have the female reproductive tract, which has quite a few different parts, so we'll discuss that in a little bit. And then secondary sexual characteristics for the female are basically just a lack of those male characteristics. So they pretty much don't have any. So when you think secondary sex characteristics, think about, the male has those and the female doesn't. And then different behaviors, including sexual behaviors and maternal behaviors. Especially in cows, you may also see females mounting other females. So that's kind of a similar behavior that they show to the males. So that can kind of depend on species, what they're doing. In pigs, and cows, if they're kind of willing to stand there and be mounted, that's a good sign that they're ready for mating. And then they show libido as well. So to just kind of show you how the male reproductive system looks like, this is in a bull exactly. So you're not going to need to know every single part of this, but we're going to go over some of the major parts and what they do. But I'm not going to ask you to label them on a diagram or anything like that. So basically, that's the bladder, and then you have your prostate gland. You have the vas deferens, which is the duct that connects to the testes. So we'll talk about that in a little more detail. And then you have the body of the penis, the sigmoid flexure, which is kind of like this S-looking shape. And then you have the penis itself. And just to kind of show you some differences in different livestock species, here's some pictures on the right. So you have a bull, a cat, and a boar. I did not know until I went to college that the boars looked like that. I thought it was kind of interesting. And so the pig in the sow, her cervix is actually kind of curvy like that too. And so the penis can actually screw in, and it helps with mating. And then in the cat, do you remember what kind of breeders cats are? Anybody?
Reflex or induced ovulators?
Yes.
Yeah. They're reflex or induced ovulators. And so if you notice on the cat's penis, there are kind of these little, you may not be able to see it very clear in this picture, but these little barbs. And so those barbs will actually help kind of stimulate the female to release the egg. So that's kind of what happens with that induced process. So, you know, both males and females have reproductive characteristics, obviously, that line up and that work in sync with each other. So just kind of interesting to note the differences between. So for male reproductive terminology, I already mentioned the spermatozoa, or just sperm is what we'll just say for the purpose of this class. So those are the mature motile. Motile just means that they have the ability to move. Male sex cells of an animal, and they will fertilize an ovum, which is just the term for an egg. So they typically have a compact head, which contains the DNA, and long flagella for movement, because they have to swim, obviously, to get to their destination. So if you look at this picture of the sperm structure, you have the head, which is kind of this whole part, and that contains the nucleus. And if you think back to the biology lecture, the nucleus is where the DNA is housed. So it's the same thing in a sperm, in that type of cell. And then you have your mitochondria. So this looks a little bit different from your typical cell, but still some of the parts are here. So what does the mitochondria do? Does anybody remember?
Isn't it the one that makes all the ATP?
Yes. Mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, and it makes the ATP. So sperm are obviously going to have to do a lot of swimming, a lot of movement. So they need that ATP to provide them with energy to be able to do that. So that's why they have that mitochondria there. And then you have the tail, which is for movement, obviously, because they have to swim through the female reproductive tract in order to get to the egg. So then the process by which an animal produces sperm is called spermatogenesis. So anytime you see genesis, that term, it kind of means like something is being made. So spermatogenesis, sperm is being made, basically. So some other male reproductive organs include the testes, which are the primary reproductive organs, so they're the gonad, and they produce a large number of sperm in what is called the seminiferous tubules. So that's just where the sperm are produced in the testes. And then the epididymis, which you can see on the right, is kind of this big curved-looking structure here, is a tube that connects the testicles to the vas deferens, which if you remember from that picture of the structure, the vas deferens is the duct that kind of connects it to the rest of the reproductive tract. So that picture is kind of but so the epididymis stores the sperm for maturation. I think that end got a little bit cut off there. And it adds a nutrient to the semen to help with the sperm movement. So the sperm will be stored in the epididymis prior to ejaculation. They're going to be kind of hanging out there, and then they need to mature because they're not just started off as mature cells. They kind of have to mature before they're ready to actually be able to fertilize an egg. And then that nutrient to semen that helps with sperm movement is really important, because obviously if you have sperm that can't move and can't get to where they need to get to, you're not going to have a very good fertility rate. So when we talk about the testes, I always like to kind of talk about the concept of thermoregulation in the body. So it doesn't just pertain to the testes. Thermoregulation is the ability of an organism to keep the temperature within a certain range. So that can be by a number of different biological processes, or like I'll explain with the testes. But so just thermo, obviously when you think thermo, you think like thermometer, temperature, and then regulation. So basically regulation of the temperature. So I try to break down some of the scientific words to kind of how I keep them straight in my mind and help you understand. So the testes are a good example of this because they are held outside of the body in a bag-like structure called the scrotum. And so this is important because this actually allows for the testes to be maintained at a lower temperature than the body because they're not kept inside the body. So if they were kept inside the body, the temperature would be too high and spermatogenesis would not be very efficient, and that would lead to infertility. because if they were inside the body, that temperature would probably kill most of the sperm. So that's why it's held outside of the body. So I was always taught that that was kind of a good example of thermoregulation and how an animal regulates the temperature of the testes. And so actually in the winter when it's cold, animals can actually, they'll kind of bring them up closer to the body a little bit to kind of keep them a little bit more warm. So it's just a really, really neat example of maintaining proper temperature for a certain process. Okay, so we also have what are called accessory organs. So I kind of mentioned that a little bit in the nutrition lecture, where you have like your main gastrointestinal tract, and then you have the organs that are kind of an accessory. They kind of help and they play a part. So the reproductive tract and accessory organs transport the sperm during ejaculation and add secretions. So semen contains large numbers of sperm together, and also secretions from the accessory glands that protect the sperm, because the sperm have a long way to go and they have a lot of obstacles in the female reproductive tract that they have to get past. So these secretions are really important in helping them do that. So the reproductive ducts, which I've mentioned, are the vas deferens. So you have two of those ducts. You have one from each testes or testicle, and then that connects them to the epididymis and the urethra. And so then you have nerves that control erection and ejaculation. So that's how that's managed. We talked a little bit about the nervous system before. So signals go through the body and then control that. And so then one difference to note here, in reproduction, poultry, they can be different in a lot of things too, but also in reproduction, they're set up a little bit differently. So male poultry, which would be roosters, have the testes within the body cavity. So that's one difference. They don't have it outside. And they also lack a penis, and they don't have an epididymis, and they don't have accessory organs. So their reproductive tract is pretty limited compared to the other animals. I mean, it still, obviously, it works, but it just doesn't have all the parts that some of the other animals. So in livestock, castration is typically a management practice depending on what species they're actually raising. So castration is just the removal of the testes, and then that can actually cause a reduction in aggression. And in companion animals, it may reduce those undesirable behaviors like spraying in cats. I've heard people say, you know, if you castrate a dog, it won't wander off as much because it's not looking for as females anymore. And then male pigs are castrated because of a major reason. So has anyone ever heard of boar taint?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the main reason that we castrate pigs. And so boar taint is basically just an offensive odor or taste that is present during cooking and eating of pork or pork products that are coming from a non-castrated male. So once they reach puberty, and there's a lot of testosterone and a lot of different hormones and everything, it's going to give this pork a really, really bad smell and a bad taste, and that's not going to be preferable for people to eat. So that's the main reason why people are castrated. So this picture is actually from the book, and this shows a picture of the female reproductive tract, and this is actually in a cow. So I'm going to kind of go over it, and then I'll show you the poultry female tract in a little bit. So it might be a little bit different to anything that you've seen before if you've seen like a human reproductive tract in biology or anything. So you have, instead of one uterus, a lot of livestock species have what are called uterine horns. And so if you kind of look at their structure, they look a little bit like a horn. So that term kind of makes sense. So they have two uterine horns that are connected to the ovaries by the oviduct, which is kind of like a long duct there that connects those. So kind of like the vas deferens in the male. And then you have the cervix here, and then you have this whole area would be the vagina. You have where the urethra meets. And so then that's pretty much how it looks in the cow. The sow is very, very similar to this. And sheep and goats as well are fairly similar to this structure. So for the purpose of this class, I'm just going to show you the cow and how it differs from poultry. But those are the major parts. So the ovaries, like I said, you have two, except in the chicken, and their principal function is to produce ova, or eggs. So ovum is the scientific term for one egg, and then ova would be for multiple eggs. But I'll probably just say eggs, just like I'll probably just use the word sperm. So ovum is singular. So in the mammalian reproductive tract, the egg is caught by the infundibulum of the oviduct, which functions to move the egg to the uterus. So basically, it kind of just comes out of the ovary, and it's caught by this thing called the infundibulum, which is connected to the oviduct, and then the oviduct is going to start moving that egg towards the uterus. So the oviduct is actually the site of fertilization. That is where fertilization should occur. Of course, things don't always go as planned, and there are chances that the egg can be fertilized in other places. But that's the site of fertilization that typically happens, and that's where you want it to happen for a pregnancy to develop and to not have any complications. So that's kind of a really important thing to know, and a good takeaway from this lecture is at least know where the site of fertilization is. So then the uterus is where the embryo will actually implant once it's been fertilized, and then the fetus will begin to develop. And then, like I said, the genesis term, you have spermatogenesis is the formation of sperm. Oogenesis is the formation of eggs. And that's because their scientific name starts with a So to show you the structure of the ovum and egg, so again, like all cells, you have a nucleus that contains the DNA. So that's that little purple circle there in that picture. So it has the DNA just like the DNA is contained in the head of the sperm. And then you have a thick membrane that surrounds the mammalian egg, and that's called the zona pellucida, which I always kind of thought was a cool word when I took repro. It's kind of a fun word to say. So, at least for me, because I'm a nerd. So sperm must successfully interact with the zona pellucida in order for fertilization to occur. And so we'll kind of talk a little bit about that and more specifics later. But so that's a really, really important part of the egg structure. And then outside of the zona pellucida, you have the corona radiata, which is just kind of all of these little cells that you see kind of hanging out around the egg. And those are important because they supply the cell with vital protein. Because obviously cells need a lot to function and to grow. So it's really good that it has all of these proteins to keep it healthy so that it can then be fertilized. So to show you the difference in how mammals differ a little bit from poultry as far as reproduction, this is the avian female reproductive tract. So poultry just have one ovary and then a single, and the reproductive tract known confusingly as the oviduct. So in the picture of the cow, the oviduct connects the ovary to the uterus, and then that's as far as it goes, right? But so in poultry, kind of this whole thing is known as the oviduct until you get to the uterus. So you kind of have different parts of the oviduct in poultry because it's a longer structure. It makes up more of a percentage of the fat. So when poultry are developing, the left ovary and the left oviduct will develop while the right ovary and the right oviduct will regress. So they actually start off with two, but only the left side develops. So they end up with just one. So that's kind of an important difference to note there. So like I said, you have the different parts that you can see on this picture. So you kind of have your follicles here that are going to be caught by the infundibulum and then transported through the oviduct, similar to the magnum and the isthmus are just different parts of the oviduct, and so different parts of egg production are going to happen in each of those. And then in the uterus, in poultry, is actually where the shell is going to be laid down. So that's where the cell is going to start forming. You can kind of see from this picture that looks like an egg starting to actually take shape, and that's because it's getting the shell put on. So how do reproductive organs develop? So you have embryonic cells that are destined to become gamete. So embryonic cells or germ cells are cells that are not differentiated, meaning they don't have a function yet. They're going to eventually become specific types of cells like fat cells or sex cells or all the different types of cells that you have. But embryonic cells and stem cells have not been differentiated yet. So they haven't really started down their path of what they're going to become. So in reproduction, those embryonic cells that are destined to become gametes, or sex cells, are the primordial germ cells. So germ cells and embryonic cells just mean undifferentiated cells that migrate to the gonads in the embryo, so the embryonic gonad, early in fetal development. So as a fetus is developing, and it's developing the gonads, so the ovaries and the testes, you're going to have this migration of these stem cells to the gonads, and then that will eventually cause them to become the gametes, so the sperm and the egg. So once they arrive in the gonad, they will develop into either the gonia, which is the egg, or spermatogonia, which is sperm. And so the gonia kind of just means that they're not fully sperm or fully an egg yet. That's kind of like the step before that, because remember, they have to mature to become actual like functional cells. So that's just the gonia part of that term. Basically, just means they're not fully mature yet. It's kind of the precursor to the mature stage. So in males, after puberty, those spermatogonia, so they're going to become sperm, will undergo multiplication and differentiation to become the sperm. So they've already kind of differentiated a little bit at the stage of arriving in the gonad, but then in the actual female and male, they're going to actually differentiate further to become the actual spermatozoa and the egg. So in females, egg production or oogenesis occurs only during fetal development. So that's a really important difference between males and females, because males can continue producing sperm throughout their life, but females are born with the number of eggs that they're going to have for the rest of their life. That process does not happen at any other time. So those are some important differences. So again, genesis is the process of making something. So I'm going to talk about gametogenesis, gametogenesis. So spermatogenesis, which is just the formation of sperm, occurs throughout the life of the male, except in seasonal breeders, where it may be restricted to a breeding season because they're not really needing to produce sperm all year round, but they can for the entirety of their life. And then, like I said, in females, the number of eggs in the ovary is established at birth. So once that process is done, it's done, and the female's not going to produce any more eggs at any point in time. So meiosis is just the division of cells during the production of gametes to produce the gametes, so the sperm and the egg. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in detail. So you should all be familiar with the term mitosis. We talked about that in the biology lecture. So mitosis is just the process where a single cell divides to perform two identical daughter cells. And so if you think back, we talked about the fact that this is important for growth, because if you're growing, you obviously need more cells to do that. And then cell turnover. So when cells get old and die, you need to be able to replace them. So you need to have mitosis for growth. You need the already available cells to be able to divide and replace those cells that are dying. So if you think back to the genetics lecture where we talked about diploid versus haploid, so mitosis, you're going to start with a diploid cell, and you're going to end with a diploid cell. So this differs a little bit from meiosis. So in mitosis, you end up with the same amount of chromosomes in the daughter cells as you started with. It's identical to the parent cell. So meiosis is a type of cell division that results in 4 daughter cells, and each of those have half the number of chromosomes of the parent cell. So mitosis can be used for a lot of different cells in the body. Meiosis is pretty much specifically for production of the gametes, because that's really the only time that you need to produce cells that only contain half the chromosomes. And that's because eventually, if the sperm contains half and the eggs contain half, they're going to mate and fertilize to become a whole. They're going to have 2 chromosomes. So you get one from your mom and one from your dad. So that's why meiosis needs to happen that way. So it's for the production of gametes. So different from mitosis, in meiosis, you're going from diploid with 2 chromosomes to haploid cells with 1 chromosome. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. And so just to kind of further show you, you're not going to need to draw this or anything crazy like that, so don't get overwhelmed by this picture. Just to kind of show you just the process of how that's happening and so what you're ending up with. So here you have mitosis on the right. So you have your diploid. So it's diploid. So you see you have your pairs of chromosomes. They're in sets of 2. And then those are going to be separated, and then they will eventually form these daughter nuclei that are genetically identical to the parent. So they're going to contain, it's not very clear in this picture, but, well, so you have 2 blue and you have 2 red. So they're going to contain pairs of chromosomes as well. So they're going to be identical to the cell that you started with, and they're going to be diploid. So in meiosis, you're going to end up with 4 because you end up with these 2 daughter cells right here that kind of look similar to mitosis, but then they go one step further, and those are divided into in half again. So you end up with 4 daughter cells that are not genetically identical to the parent cell because they only have 1 chromosome in each one from each set. So sex determination is really important, and it has to do with the sex chromosomes. So sex is determined genetically, and so mammals having the sex chromosomes XY will develop as males, and mammals that are XX will develop as female. So the gene that contains or that controls sex is on the Y chromosome, and so therefore if the Y chromosome only comes from the male, men or males will determine the sex of the offspring. So I always thought the story of Henry VIII is kind of funny. People always talk about in reproduction that he kept marrying different women in hopes that he was going to get a son, and all the while he's actually the one that's determining the gender. So something that they didn't know back then that we know now. But so the presence of the Y chromosome is required for the development of testes, and so then the absence of that Y chromosome is what's going to signal the development of ovaries. So that's how sex is determined in mammals. Is everybody clear on that? So pretty much from your mom, you would get either, well, she can only give you X's. So you would get an X from your mom, and then from your dad, you would get either an X or a Y.
Mm-hmm.
And that would determine gender. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So again, poultry have to be strange, and their system is similar, but it's a little bit backwards. Poultry, males they use W and Z. I don't know why they can't use X and Y like everybody else. But so the males are actually the ones with the 2 Zs, and then the females are WZ. So the sex determining gene, remember in mammals it's on the Y chromosome. It's not known in poultry, but given how they're set up with the ZZ and the WZ, similar to the Y, it's kind of assumed that it's probably on the W chromosome. So as far as ductal development, mammals and birds will develop 2 sets of genital ducts, and then you have the descent of the testes into the scrotum. So in order for normal growth of the testes and spermatogenesis to take place, the testes actually have to descend into the scrotum to complete development and to be able to function properly. So that's important in mammals. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the different reproductive hormones. For the sake of this class, I'm not going to expect you to know every single hormone that controls the reproductive process because it's a lot. I took a whole class on it, and it's just, the whole thing is a lot of information, and it's incredible, everything that goes into it. But so there are kind of just a few major ones that I'd like you to be familiar with. So androgens is the term for male sex hormones. And so that the male sex hormone that comes to mind, and the major one is testosterone. And then estrogens are the female sex hormones. So again, estrogen and estradiol, probably terms you've heard before. And then progesterone is the hormone that's responsible for maintaining a pregnancy. So that's a really, really important hormone to know, because without progesterone, you may have early termination of a fetus. And then oxytocin causes the uterine contractions to start, and it also signals milk letdown from the mammary gland. I remember my anatomy professor, when he told us oxytocin, the way I always remembered what it does and that it starts uterine contractions is because he said that when his wife went into labor, because he's an animal scientist, obviously, that she kind of, it was going to take a really long time, and he had something he had to do, and he was like, let's speed this up, inject her with oxytocin. So that always kind of helps me remember that it causes uterine contractions, because I thought that was a really funny story. Apparently his wife was not amused. So other reproductive hormones, you have prostaglandins, gonadotropin releasing hormone, gonadotropin inhibitory hormone, luteinizing hormone, and then follicle stimulating hormone. So the ones that I would kind of really like you to be familiar with are the ones on the previous slide. These are just for you to kind of see, and I might talk about them a little bit, but I didn't really understand the function of these and how they regulate reproduction until my reproductive physiology class. So I don't want to go too in-depth for the sake of intro. But just so you see these, so that if you do take later animal science classes at any point in time, you're at least kind of familiar and you've seen these before. So now we're going to talk a little bit about development of the follicle and the estrous cycle. So the ovum, or the egg, it develops in the ovary in the follicle. So that's just a term that's used, follicle. So after ovulation and release of the egg, the remnants of the follicle, so what's left, will go on to form what is called a corpus luteum, or the CL. So in repro, we kind of always just called it the CL, but the technical term is the corpus luteum. So once that egg is released, obviously, pretty much the reproductive system is set up so that every time an egg is released, fertilization could happen. So everything that goes on in the ovary after that egg has been released is kind of expecting that pregnancy is going to occur. And then if pregnancy doesn't occur, then signals will kind of relay that and the process will start over. So the corpus luteum is really important because that forms once an egg is released, and that produces progesterone, which is that hormone that we talked about that maintains pregnancy. So that's why the corpus luteum, or the CL, forming after that egg is released is really, really important, because if fertilization does occur, then that CL is going to need to produce progesterone throughout the pregnancy in order to maintain that pregnancy to term. So that's kind of a really important function. So signs of estrus, which we've mentioned a little bit before in previous lectures, would be swelling and reddening of the vulva, discharge, release of pheromones or specific chemical, standing when mounted or in response to pressure, perceptive behavior, so seeking out a male, which is just kind of an interesting way to put it because it just makes it sound like you're getting on Tinder or something. But anyway. And just picture like all these cows like stalking a pasture looking for a bull. It's just kind of creepy. But so that's one of the signs of estrus. So in the estrus cycle, which we've talked a little bit about before, and I'm not going to really go into the links or anything like that. So we've talked a little bit about that already. But the biology of the estrus cycle is divided into two phases. So you have the follicular phase and the luteal phase. So the follicular phase is when the egg is growing in that follicle, remember? So the follicle is growing, and then it's ovulated. And then in the luteal phase, the corpus luteum, so luteal, is functioning. So that corpus luteum that's formed after the egg is released, that's going to produce progesterone to maintain pregnancy if it occurs, is what causes the luteal phase. So that's kind of how the estrus cycle can kind of be broken down. And then if pregnancy doesn't occur, then you're going to return to the follicular phase, and the whole process is going to start over again. To kind of put it simply, there's a lot of things that go into regulating that and how that happens. So the estrus cycle can be long. It can be 16 to 23 days roughly, or it could be short. It could be as short as 4 or 5 days. It just depends on the species. So if you think back to some of those differences that we talked about, you'll see that it does vary with species. And so then terms that you should also already be familiar with, we've talked about how animals can be polyestrous, seasonally polyestrous, or monoestrous. So polyestrous means what?
Multiple times a year.
Multiple times a year, right. And then seasonally polyestrous would be?
Just seasonally.
Right. So they only they have many estrus cycles during a certain season. Right. And then monoestrous would be one. Yep. Okay. Everyone's good on that. We've talked about those quite a bit. So mating in domestic mammals, mating, or the scientific term coitus, involves the male mounting a female at estrus. It could be artificial insemination, which we've mentioned. So artificial insemination is when the semen is manually placed into the female reproductive tract. And so the actual site of where this happens depends on the species. So depending on whether you're inseminating a cow or a pig, that semen may be inseminated in different places. So I've heard some people say that in some species you want to put it in the cervix, and then I think in pigs is where it's in the cervix, but then in cows, if you actually can get through and deposit it into the uterine horns, you'll have a better success rate. And that's because the sperm have a lot of challenges to overcome in the female reproductive tract in order to get, because remember, they have to get all the way to the oviduct to be able to fertilize the egg. So the closer that you can get them, that whole amount to the oviduct, better off your success rate and breeding rate is going to be, because you won't have all the loss from them trying to even get to that point in the tract. So make sure that, yeah.
Isn't it like the uterus is very acidic, so it kind of deteriorates?
Yeah, so the vagina is really acidic. And so it's kind of really interesting because you would think that, well, everything is kind of set up, with the idea that pregnancy is going to occur. But the female does have some kind of hurdles for sperm to get over. So the vagina can be very acidic, and some of the reproductive tract is still acidic as well. And so you will have some sperm that don't make it. And also it's kind of helps because that the sperm that does eventually fertilize the egg is a good sperm, and it's got good qualities and good mobility and things like that. So hopefully if it's functioning, it should have functioning DNA as well. So those hurdles are probably kind of set up that way as well to kind of like kill off some of the sperm that won't make it, that are not as good. So yeah, the acidity is a big one. That's a big factor that they have to get over in order to get through the rest of the tract. So if you can kind of overcome that one obstacle, you'll be depositing a lot more sperm closer to the oviduct, which will help your conception rate. Any other questions? Okay. So AI is used with the majority of dairy cows, sows, and then turkeys as well. And so with AI, we've talked about some of the advantages, is that, the sperm quality has been checked, and that you can get sperm from a certain male. So in sperm sorting, the sperm can be separated based on differences in DNA using fluorescent dyes that will bind to the DNA and stain. So this has actually been used to sort gender. So inseminating sperm, you can inseminate them that have been sorted, which would result in 90% of the offspring of a selected gender. So that's kind of cool if for some reason you really, really needed more of one gender than another. I can't imagine that that's very cheap, so I don't know how often that would actually be used, but it is something that is available. So this whole time we've been talking about fertilization, right? Because that's the goal. If you want an animal to produce offspring, fertilization has to happen. So fertilization is just the fusion of male and female gametes, so the sperm and the egg, to form what is called a zygote. So the zona pellucida, which is that membrane that surrounds the egg, is required for sperm-egg recognition. So in order for fertilization to take place, the sperm have to interact with the zona pellucida. So after fertilization, the changes in the zona pellucida will prevent further sperm from binding. So when that first sperm comes into contact with the zona pellucida will actually cause changes in that sperm that allow it to fertilize the egg. And then once that happens, the zona pellucida changes so that further sperm can't bind. So only one. And this is important because it prevents what's called polyspermy, which is fertilization by more than one sperm. And so fertilization by more than one sperm, if it happened, would more than likely not result in offspring, or it would cause severe defects. But I'm pretty sure if it happens, that egg won't even really develop. So that's really, really important, and kind of another way that the reproductive system is regulated. So just to kind of give you a visual representation of this, you don't need to worry about all of the parts on here. So this big thing is the egg, and then obviously you have your little sperm that are coming in. So when the sperm gets to the zona pellucida, the acrosome, which is the top of the sperm, which you don't really necessarily need to know that term, but changes will happen in that. It will penetrate the zona pellucida, and then changes happen in the zona pellucida that will prevent others from binding later. And then you see fertilization will occur, and then that egg will start to develop. And once fertilization occurs, it's called a zygote. So immediately when fertilization happens, the term for that is a zygote. Does anybody have any questions on that? So in order for pregnancy to happen, like I said, you need fertilization. So then after you have fertilization, then you have obviously pregnancy or gestation. So those two terms are kind of one and the same. So you have embryonic or fetal membranes that will surround the developing fetus. And then between the membranes, you have a fluid-filled cavities that protect the embryo and the fetus from mechanical shocks or injuries. So if the mom is kind of moving around or is hit or anything, it just kind of protects it from just like bouncing around in there. And then you have the placenta, which is the site of contact between the developing embryo and the mother. So the placenta is extremely important. So be familiar with the term placenta and what it does, because it provides nutrients, respiratory gases, and waste exchanged across the placenta. So it brings nutrients to the fetus. Any respiratory gases like carbon dioxide, which we produce when we breathe, those will be coming through the placenta to then go through the mom's system and be let off. So the placenta is really, really important. Another thing that's critical in order to actually have and maintain a pregnancy is pregnancy recognition. And so it is critical that the conceptus, so the fetus, signals its presence to the mother in order to allow pregnancy to continue. So we're not going to go into all the details of how that happens, but there's a lot of hormone signaling, like I said, that controls the reproductive processes. And so once that fetus develops, it has to signal back to the mother that pregnancy has occurred so that that corpus luteum will remain and progesterone will be produced to maintain that pregnancy to term. And other things in the reproductive tract will also start happening to maintain that pregnancy. The pregnancy recognition is an extremely critical process of pregnancy and gestation. So parturition is just a fancy word for giving birth. So that happens in essentially 3 stages. So phase 1 would be contractions of the uterus until the cervix is completely dilated. And so then the end of phase 1 would be marked by that transition. So the phase 2 is the contraction of the uterus to deliver the neonate through the birth canal. And then phase 3, once the neonate or the baby animal has been born, you have contraction of the uterus delivering the placenta and fetal membranes. So it's really important that the placenta and fetal membranes are expelled, because if not, it can cause infection, and that can be really, really bad and really, really damage the reproductive possibilities of that animal. And it can, if the infection gets really bad, it can even be fatal. So you want to make sure that the placenta and fetal membranes come out. Some animals will actually eat their placenta because it's actually filled with nutrients, and so it can be fairly nutritious. So I know my reproductive professor, actually the placenta contains stem cells, and he's a repro professor, so he was obsessed. His license plate was placenta without the E. It was a bonus question on our test, which is why I still remember. But he actually was so into repro that when his daughters were born, he saved their placenta for future stem cells in case they ever get some disease or whatever, which is kind of smart but kind of gross because he literally like took it home in a jar. And so he was saying at his daughter's 16th birthday, he's going to give them their placentas, which is just really strange. But so it does, he was just really into repro. But so it does have stem cells and nutrients and things that can be beneficial. So just a fun little story about my repro professor at Tech.
Yes. That's the next level.
Yeah, I was like, that is so creepy. Someone made a meme of him that was like his face that was like, takes starters placentas and keeps them in a jar. It was like, It was hilarious. We all thought it was the weirdest thing, but he just thought it was so cool. Yeah, I was like, your poor daughters. Like,
Yeah, somebody was asking, does his kids know that he did that? Or are they just gonna,
when I was there, they were actually like 7 and 8, so they didn't know. So I guess at some point when they get older, he's going to tell them. I mean, it'll be really handy if they ever like get a disease and need stem cells. They have their own stem cells in a jar. But I was just like, not really the typical route. But he joked that at their 16th birthday, he was going to present them with it. So I don't know.
not exactly sweet 16, yeah.
Right.
I was like, at least do that like after the party once their friends have left.
Yes. Oh, yes. Oh.
But yeah, Dr. Knight was a very, very interesting character. So prior to parturition, there's actually a buildup of the uterine muscles because those are going to be needed for contraction to actually expel the fetus. So there can be lots of reproductive problems, tons. These are just a couple that I kind of wanted to point out. But there can be problems at any point in that process. There can be problems during mitosis and meiosis and how the cells divide. There can be problems during how fertilization happens. There can be problems in transport to the uterus, all kinds of problems. And then in development of that fetus, just I didn't really realize until I took repro how lucky you are to actually like be born normal. I don't know. Like it's crazy to me how much it happens that most people or most animals are born without any problems because there are just so many places where things can happen. So it's pretty incredible that nature can do that. The reproductive problems that can occur kind of outside of the development side of things, dystocia, which we talked about before, which is just difficulty giving birth. And so there's typically a high incidence of dystocia in first calf heifers and also with delivery of twins. That can be a bit of a problem. Brucellosis is another problem. That's a bacterial disease that can affect different livestock species as well as people, and that will cause abortion most frequently in the 4th and 5th months of pregnancy, and it will impair fetal development. Leptospirosis is also another big one that can cause a series of problems, including fever and liver and kidney damage in livestock and people. So just some to be aware of. Other reproductive problems that are not really an infection, that are just kind of things that happens in development. So cryptorchidism is a problem that can occur, and so that is heritable, meaning that it can be passed down genetically. So it's found in pigs and to a lesser extent cattle and sheep. It can also be found in companion animals like horses and dogs. And so I actually didn't even put the definition on here. I'm just realizing. So cryptorchidism is basically when the testes do not descend into the scrotum. Gotcha. So that's important for proper functioning. If you remember, they have to descend. So if they don't, that animal is called a cryptorchid. And so you could have there's some cases where you have like a unilateral cryptorchid where one testes will actually descend. And then bilateral cryptorchid would be where both of them actually don't descend. So if one of them descends, that animal would still be able to produce some sperm. But if neither one of them descend, then you're probably going to have an infertile male animal there. So that's an issue that can happen. And like I said, it is heritable. So if you have an animal that is a cryptorchid, you want to go ahead and get that animal out of your herd or your breeding stock. So intersex can also happen. So free Martinism is where 90% of females are completely infertile because they have incompletely formed reproductive tract and very small ovaries. And so this is actually observed when there are twin fetuses and you have one male and one female. And so the reason that this happens is because if you have one male and one female and they're sharing those fetuses are connected through, different like ways that they get nutrients and all of that exchange of everything. And so when the hormones or when the characteristics from that Y chromosome of the male are actually causing that fetus to become a male, some of those can also influence that female twin. And so what that's going to do is that's going to leave that female twin with an incompletely formed reproductive tract and really, really small ovaries, because the hormones from the male were really influencing the development of that female. Because remember, that's from the Y. So that's kind of a problem that can occur. So if you have a cow that just happens to have a male and a female offspring, you may not want to use that female for breeding, because there's a chance that she may be what's called a free martin. So that's called free martinism. And I cannot remember the story behind that term to save my life, but I'll look it up later. So another issue you can have is mismating in dogs. Mismating is just kind of a term for like when mating happens and you didn't really want it to. So in order to prevent that, you want to make sure that the female doesn't have the opportunity to mate. So if you have a female dog and you want her to mate to a certain other dog, like if you're doing purebred breeding, you want to make sure she's confined during estrus, because you never know when a male dog may come into your yard. Pregnancy can be terminated by surgery or obviously by spaying, which would just prevent it anyway. But you can do that during pregnancy in order to terminate that pregnancy. Other ways to do that would be dopamine agonists that are given in combination with a prostaglandin, which will induce those uterine contractions and exert a luteolytic effect. So lytic basically means you're kind of breaking something down. So luteolytic would basically destroy that corpus luteum, which, if you remember, is producing the progesterone that's maintaining the pregnancy. So if the corpus luteum is destroyed, then pregnancy is no longer going to be maintained, and that follicular phase is going to start over. So you can give them something that will have a luteolytic effect. So as far as reproductive manipulation in livestock, because the reproductive tract and reproductive system, the whole process is controlled by a lot of hormonal feedback. So drugs can actually be used to control reproduction in livestock. So you can inject progesterone, MGA, prostaglandin, which is luteolise, which some of you, if you have cattle, may be familiar with. You can give them that in order to make them come into heat, so you can kind of synchronize your cows. GnRH, follicle stimulating hormone, oxytocin, and dopamine agonist are just some of the things that you can use to manipulate the reproductive cycle. And you may want to do this depending on your breeding schedule, and this is a good way to do it so that you have either all of your cows or a group of your cows, depending on how many you have, kind of coming into heat, being bred at similar times so that you get calving around the same few weeks or kind of similar times to make your management system a little bit better as far as staying on a schedule. So that's where this reproductive manipulation can come in. So there are several pregnancy detection diagnostic kits. In dogs, the pregnancy hormone relaxin is detectable in the serum 22 to 27 days after mating, which by that point you're already a little bit into the pregnancy gestation period. Cattle, there's the presence of a placental protein that can be used to determine whether or not a cow is pregnant. Contraception in wildlife, the traditional approach has been to use hunting or culling. Non-lethal method of population control is contraception or reduced fertility. And a successful method it has been immunization against the gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which will prevent ovulation. So those are just some things that you can use. Also, if you're doing AI, you can use ultrasounds to determine if you were successful. And then, of course, at the end of when that animal is supposed to give birth and they don't, then you know whether they were pregnant or not. But that's not always the best method. So if you can figure that out beforehand, then you can go ahead and rebreed that animal. So, but I'm sure a lot of these specific tests, again, are probably expensive. Not everyone's going to use them. I know typically in most livestock species, people just do like ultrasound checks, pregnancy checks to make sure that, just to determine if it's in there. And in cows, you can actually do some palpations and things like that. So any questions on repro? Kind of a lot of information. Yeah, it's a lot to take in. I tried to keep it fairly generic as far as what I was showing you. And again, some of it, like I said, like some of those specific hormones and all of that, I'm not going to expect you to know. So basically what I want you to get from the biology chapter, the genetics chapter, nutrition, and repro. And then next week we'll do growth and development. Basically what I want you to kind of come away with is concepts and be familiar with some of like the generic terms, like gamete is a sex cell, like know some of those basic things. But really overall concepts and processes, just kind of understand general things and how things happen and maybe a little bit of why they happen that way. So if y'all don't have any more questions, then have a good weekend and I will see y'all next week.
Have a good weekend. See you Tuesday.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
See you Thursday, I guess.
Good luck with your interview process.
I think so.
That's what it says on the syllabus.
Don't pay attention to that. Okay. I wouldn't worry about that yet.